Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 149, and today's episode is well focused on Wild and Evil, the debut album from I guess you can say semi-recognized German metal band Sinner. Again, best known for releasing albums such as Danger Zone, Touch of Sin, Coming Out Fighting, Dangerous Charm, and whatnot, I guess. But these days, of course, released, I guess, some albums that at least people really do dig, you know, and albums like, for example, The Nature of Evil, Mark of Sanity, There Will Be Execution, you know, again, all Matt Sinner, who, of course, is connected to either Gamma Ray and Primal Fear. But this was the first album, and this was the first album that, I guess in a way, Matt Sinner released. Again, released through SL Records at least sometime in 1982, and SL Records were a pretty semi-small label, though not always focused on metal or hard rock albums, but they definitely had at least a few, or at least maybe a couple, sort of heavy or early hard rock albums in the early 80s. But Wild and Evil by Sinner is one of the more noticeable or notable albums. That was a bit of a struggle to somehow pronounce all that. But there it is. Now, the lineup for this, of course, Wild and Evil, for Sinner here. Again, Matt Sinner, though he's been going by the name Matthias Losch. I think that might be his actual name. Yes, he's actually going by his real name for this album instead of Matt Sinner, which was becoming his more synonym name, at least the name that everyone would recognize. Even again, if you look into like the writing credits for like the Primal Fear albums and Gamma Ray, but he's going by his real name for this album. We also have Calo Rapallo on guitars, Frank Middleback. Yeah, Middleback. Also on guitars, Edgar Patrick on drums, and of course, also apparently on guitar as well is Wolfgang Werner. So apparently there were three on this album, though. I'll get into production and mixing for this album here, but technically there's three guitar players on this album, but only one bass player, again, and Matt Sinner. Well, I'm just gonna call him Matt Sinner for this album, even though he's going by the original name, his real birth name Matthias Losch, but still, I'm just going to refer to him as Matt Sinner. Wild and Evil, of course, was recorded at Stygiel Studios in D7312 in Kirchheim, Tech, Germany. I hope I pronounced all that correctly. And it was mastered at SST Bruggemann. Hope I'm pronouncing all of this correctly. GmbH, Germany. And of course, it's me fucking up all of this is probably kind of an embarrassment, I guess, to my dad's, at least mother's side of the family, which was actually was from Germany. So this is probably a little bit of embarrassment that I don't really understand, or I'm butchering some of this shit. So there you go. Not to beat myself up there. Okay, let's definitely just move on, I guess, since let's just get into the actual album itself. So, we have at least about 11 songs here, and apparently it all clocks in at 43 minutes and 39 seconds. Alright, so your 11 songs here, again, beginning with Loser of Love, No Speed Limit, Murder, Riding on the White Horse, Lost in a Dream, Heat of the Night, FTA, which I have no clue what it actually stands for. I've even paid as much attention to the lyrics in this song, but I don't know what it actually stands for. They just, again, all that is, at least is the main chorus lyrics for at least the song as well, just FTA. I don't know what the fuck it even means. Again, I can't even look up the lyrics for the sound because I really don't own a physical copy, because of, even though I know it's probably not that difficult to obtain online as far as, you know, like Discogs, but I don't know if lyrics were ever printed for this album to begin with. So I don't know what the hell FTA really stands for, but it's just called FTA. That's about it, and that's what you get from the song. So I'm just gonna go along with that. I'm just gonna move on to the next song, which is Silly Thing, Shaking the Devil's Hand, The Sin, and then finally ending with Trouble. So there's your 11 songs. Now, if you are definitely familiar with some of at least Sinner's material from at least maybe Danger Zone, and to an extent Touch of Sin and Dangerous Charm, and let alone some of the more 90s or more recent stuff, this album might come across as, even the follow-up, Fast Decision, might come across as a little bit of a slight surprise. Even though this album is still very rockin', it almost has a very almost new wave or British heavy metal edge to it. Again, not too far off from, let's say, Wheels of Steel from Saxon, or the first Tigers of Pantang album in a way, or even, for an example, too, Samson with Head On, or, like that. It's not too far off the beaten path of those albums. Let's say even, if I have to compare to any German bands, it would probably be maybe the first two albums from Accept, being, of course, the self-titled album and I'm a Rebel. Because, again, it does play around with some slight disco kind of very bassy sort of beats here on the sound that reminds me of some of the songs off of I'm a Rebel. But at the same time, there is definitely also a clear influence from Scorpions. It's definitely for mostly Love Drive and Animal Magnetism, and maybe some of the more rockin', more heavier stuff off of Blackout. A little cross between those three albums. So you get a mix match of the very almost native German sort of hard rock or early proto-metal sound on the sound, but again, a little bit more of the sort of new wave of British heavy metal influence on this one. Hell, even at times you do get a little bit of a Thin Lizzy influence here. You can hear, some of that, maybe like Chinatown, or maybe even a Renegade, or of course Thunder and Lightning. A little bit of that kind of sound. You get bits of that here and there on this album right here from Sinner. But again, it's still fairly kind of, it's not the straight up more anthemic, more really big arena style German metal that you'll end up getting with like Danger Zone. Again, the stuff that they'd be more notable under like the Noise Records catalog or the label. You don't really get any of that kind of sound. It's this really early 80s or late 70s hard rock / heavy metal on here. That's what you definitely get to get, and it's definitely heard on songs, for example, like Loser of Love, Murder, Riding the White Horse, even, of course, Silly Thing, Shaking the Devil's Hand, and The Sin. All, of course, have this kind of really more upbeat, more mid-pace style, straight up rock kind of stuff. Hell, some of the bits like the Sin has a slight AC/DC edge going on to it, but again, it's not too far off also off of stuff off of like Wheels of Steel from Saxon. So it plays around with these kind of almost very just very primitive, more bare bones, meat and potato style hard rock riffs and pacing and beats and whatnot. You get that structuring. That's what comes off in some of these. As far as really heavy songs, again, the song FTA and even No Speed Limit, these are the only two songs I come across as being more heavier off the album. They are definitely more faster songs, but they're the closest you'll definitely get to more of the straight up, almost speed metal. But still not quite as nearly as developed, because it still come off as kind of boogie-like in a way. Again, not too far off from like, let's say like a Baron Rojo or early AC/DC or Saxon and whatnot. It's not too far off from that sound, or of course early Accept. So it's not too off from at least the formula as we're speaking about. But there's still some slightly lightweight songs on here, like for example, like Lost in a Dream, Silly Thing, and of course Trouble. Trouble is probably the more straight up ballad off the album here, and this is where you really can draw some comparisons to, of course, Scorpions, but it's not nearly as pulled off nearly as well as, let's say, what the guys of Scorpions were able to really pull off their ballads. You know, how the way they craft it. It's not really nearly as close to that. But it's a bit of a try, though. And it's a very much a genuine effort. But still, you can't really somehow capture the sort of, at least the brilliance that Scorpions was able to really kind of capture with their ballads, even to an extent. So there we go. Either way, there's really nothing really completely groundbreaking on the album here, but at the same time, I think it's still a very fun, enjoyable album from beginning to end. I do think it's a pretty solid album. I enjoy it. I know it's not going to be everyone's go-to album for, let's say, when it comes to anything from Sinner, but I always kind of dug this album, especially for the fact that it's a more bare bones, more straightforward, primitive style album, and it's a really good, decent presentation of, or just example of what the early sort of German rock scene was kind of like in this period. You had yet to really hear bands, for example, like Running Wild, or even Halloween, or any of that. It's or even what, except when I'm developing into that really would kind of really push things forward for at least that sort of German sound, and what ended up really reshaping the sound, which is where I think as bands like Sinner really kind of went towards. Again, Scorpions and Accept, when it came to albums like Blackout or Love at First Sting, and of course with Accept, with like Breaker, Restless and Wild, and Balls to the Wall, those albums reshaped a lot of the just the overall feel for Germany in terms of the hard rock and heavy metal scene. It changed it to where everyone now was kind of trying to compete with those kind of records, and were changing their sound to somewhat be more similar to that. That's why bands like Faithful Breath and whatnot started heaving up a little bit of their sound, because again, those albums changed the game in Germany. And again, a band like Sinner fell into that, because again, these first two Sinner albums, again, like Wild and Evil and Fast Decision, were very more typical of the early scene in Germany when it comes to the harder bands. Again, it was more streamlined, more primitive. You can tell what other influences from when it comes to like the sort of old school 70s hard and heavy kind of bands like UFO and whatnot. But the minute Accept and Scorpion started releasing their groundbreaking albums in that time period from 82 to 85 or 84, Sinner had to jump onto that, and in a way, Danger Zone kind of fell into that sort of pool there. It fell into that, and everyone was just starting to change their sound. And when you go back into listening to like Wild and Evil and Fast Decision by Sinner, they're not. It's like, while Fast Decision was kind of again a transition, still though it's just very different when it comes to Wild and Evil. It has a more different approach to its sort of primitive hard rock sound, and that's what it is. It's definitely early proto metal or early heavy metal in the early 80s, but again, it's not nearly as developed. But I still have I've got a very sentimental feel towards this one, and I think it's got a slight charm to it, and something to where it's like I can kind of really appreciate the genuine sort of side of what they're on this album, what they're able to cut, what they came up with here. It comes off genuine, doesn't feel completely forced. It's just a really young band that's just going to a studio trying to record music or write music and release music that's going to give people a bit of a first impression and maybe give you an idea of what these guys are probably about. And that's just basically a band that's just wants to be who they are and play what they want to play, and hope that at least people were able to at least catch on to that. Something again, just like my overall Album of the Week episode on the first Oz album. Again, they wanted to release a record that's going to give people an idea of what they're probably are going to end up being like on stage, even though not all of it ends up translating well in the studio than it probably would in a live setting, because some of these songs would have sounded at least better in a live setting. And again, the mixing for this album, again, supposedly there's 3 guitar players listed here. I mean, there's 4 guys on the fucking artwork, but there's really 5 guys listed. because you got 3 guitar players, but the mixing for the sound, it sounds like there's only been 1 guitar player for the most part. So it's not really quite really put on who recorded what. If they were only, again, if you're just listening to 3 just because of they are on it, but you're not listening on which songs were recorded with which guitar player, you know. It's not a whole lot of that kind of information that's really present there. But the mixing and everything, it becomes a little confusing in that regard at times, even though production values do kind of change overall here and there on the album. But at the same time, everything just sounds like it's been mixed with 1 guitar, unlike the fucking right channel of the album. And guitar solos, when they do come in, they're either going to be on the left channel or they're going to be more put in the center, basically. And that's where everything just comes a little bit confusing at times. Because again, it's not a greatly mixed album. But again, it's got a raw feel, and it gives the album a little bit of an edge to it that kind of at least brings something out of it and doesn't make it sound so cut rate. When it probably is, but it at least adds a little something to it, in my opinion. So there we go. So that's it. That's my overall thoughts I can have on Wild and Evil from Sinner. Again, it's not their for greatest effort, but it is a first effort, and it's a fine starting effort for a band that probably going to end up releasing slightly better albums after this. But we'll probably take a nosedive when it comes to albums, like, for example, maybe Coming Out Fighting and not Fast Decision, Dangerous Charm. So there you go. That's pretty much where I am. As far as when it comes to what ends up happening to the members in the band, because the only really consistent member in Sinner was, of course, Matt Sinner. So after this album, most of the guys in this band would last for the second album, or they'll just end up leaving or joining other bands, you know. That's kind of a situation here. I mean, Matt Sinner would go from using his birth name, Matthias Losch, to then changing it back to Matt Sinner by Fast Decision. So by Fast Decision, he's already developed his trademark name that everybody will end up just be more recognized with. So, but as far as the other guys, Color Apollo would leave the band after this album and would just end up appearing in Tyrant Pace 2 years or 3 years later, actually, for the Long Live Metal album, which again, also on Long Live Metal, also ended up featuring another member that was, of course, was a part of Sinner for this album that he played with, and that would be Edgar Patrick, who would end up leaving the band after Fast Decision and would eventually join Tyrant Pace for the Eye to Eye album. So Edgar Patrick beat Color Apollo to the punch in Tyrant Pace, but eventually by Long Live Metal, both the two guys were finally to work together again, and for the Long Live Metal album. And after that, they would be gone out of Tyrant Pace. But eventually, Edgar Patrick, after Tyrant Pace and Sinner, would end up in, Bonfire for albums like Point Blank, Knockout, and of course then the Live the Beast album. So there we go, again from 1993. So there we go. As for Frank Mittelbach, he also would leave after Fast Decision, but he would eventually would join Tyrant Pace only for the Eye to Eye album, because after that he'd be gone. So he didn't really end up being reunited with the other two guys for at least with Color Apollo for Long Live Metal. As far as the other guy here, the last guitar player, which is Wolfgang Warner, this would be the only effort he would ever have on record, because he was gone. This was the only thing he ever did with for as far as recording music, and he just would drop out off the face of the earth. So I don't know if he was like a session member for this album or whatnot, but this is the only album he's ever has any sort of credit on as far as a musician to begin with. So Wolfgang Warner is pretty much at this point, who knows where the fuck he's been, but this is the only album he has any sort of notable recognition for. That's about it. Everyone else would all end up in Tyrant Pace one way or another, which again is, Ralph Scheepers. Eventually, Matt Sinner and Ralph Sheepers would end up, of course, in Gamma Ray, and of course, together with Primal Fear to this day. So, in one shape or another, all 4 of the guys on this album would work with Ralph Sheepers, which is so what a weird, funny coincidence. But Matt Sinner, with his partnership with Ralph Sheepers, would be way after any of the 3 guys on this album. So that is just real funny to me. It's, again, really interesting facts, but it all belongs as part of this video here. So there we go. That's it for, of course, my overall just focus on Wild and Evil from Sinner. Again, if you are familiar with this album from Sinner, or you're just familiar with the band Sinner to begin with, and of course Matt Sinner himself, because of his work with bands like Gamma Ray and Primal Fear, if you've ever listened to this album and if you have any sort of thoughts, again, whether it be positive or negative, you can leave them in the comment section below. But if you have never checked out Wild and Evil and you've been kind of curious because you've been looking for a copy for a long time, you can either check it out on YouTube, or it's not that difficult to obtain, let's say on Discogs, mostly on record. Don't try and go after any CD copies of it, because there is a CD copy that was released through Coke Records in 1989, but that's now kind of difficult to obtain, because you're either going to pay 30 or 50 bucks for it, or you're going to pay 80 bucks, depending for whoever is offering the album for whatever price. So there we go. But again, it's not the most let's say first thing you should listen to. No, it's not definitive, or just it's not the first thing you really should be checking out by Sinner, but it's decent enough album that I think is still enjoyable enough. So that's all I can say there for you. Hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrash saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.